Hello and welcome. My name is Cindy Heitzman, Executive Director for the California Preservation Foundation. Thank you for joining this webinar, Why Save Historic Windows? The format for today's webinar will include an hour presentation followed by a time for question and answers. There's a toolbar on the right of your screen. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and I will either reply to you or hold the question until the end for the panelists to answer. Please, also at this time, under the audio tab, select if you are listening through the telephone or speakers. To hide or unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Today's presentation will be by Taylor Loudon, Loudon Historical Architecture, and Bill Essert, President, Wooden Windows, Incorporated. G. Taylor Loudon has architectural degrees from the University of Virginia and Columbia University. His portfolio of work includes numerous New York City and Los Angeles area landmarks. Since 2004, he's consulted as an independent historical architect. Loudon's projects have been recognized for excellence in the field of historical architecture and preservation, receiving a National Trust Preservation Award and Los Angeles Conservancy Preservation Design Awards. He served over 2 terms as the architectural representative on a Los Angeles Planning Department Historic Preservation Overlay Zone Review Board. Loudon has presented several sessions at California Preservation Foundation conferences, directing panels on historic preservation, design, and workshop seminars on the Secretary of the Interior standards. He serves on CPF's Education Committee, and in 2011 he received a Certificate of Recognition by the City of Los Angeles for his work in the field of historic preservation. For more than 30 years, Wooden Window has been crafting fine, custom-made wooden doors and windows for residences and commercial buildings throughout California. Led since 1990 by President Bill Essert, Wooden Windows is a premier specialist in architectural restoration. Entering the woodworking trade as an apprentice to an artisan builder, Bill Essert has become an acknowledged expert in the field of historical preservation. Wooden Window has restored or replaced over 500,000 doors and windows in projects including Stanford's Hoover Pavilion, the UC Berkeley Chancellor's Residence, the Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite National Park, San Francisco Mission Library, Earl Warren Building and Courthouse, the Bohemian City Club, the Mark Hopkins Hotel, Antelope Valley Indian Museum, and others, some dating back to the mid-18th century. Bill is active in numerous preservation associations and currently sits on the education and program committees of the California Preservation Foundation. When not building extraordinary windows and doors or working to preserve our architectural heritage, Bill is a museum, having played trumpet with San Francisco Ballet and the Oakland Symphony. He lives in the East Bay in a historic 1903 brown shingle craftsman home. We thank you for joining us.
Hello, my name is Taylor Loudon. I'll be your historical architect this afternoon. Good afternoon. The question of why save historic windows seems to be pretty obvious. The opening slide I have is from residents that I assisted in a rehabilitation. The premise is that windows don't just add to the value of the house in the sense they are the value of the house. And in the window that you see here, they can range, of course, from art, glass, and phenomenally important and significant parts of the house's character, or they can be fairly mundane. And the Secretary of the Interior standards, which of course we'll talk about subsequently, don't necessarily address that all windows have to be as majestic as this to be important, but that sometimes it's the most mundane windows, as in, say, factory windows, that add to the significance of the structure. So the next slide that we'd like to discuss has to do with the vocabulary of the structure and how the window sort of reinforces that. In effect, the silent language probably can be interpreted as a stylistic language, and you can think of ranging from Gothic tracery windows, to large plate glass from the early modernist era to the rather different combinations of windows that we look at today. In effect, the summary statement is the windows fit the buildings and vice versa. So as we will find in this throughout our webinar, replacement windows often can take on almost a sinister term, like how have you been changing the structure by changing the window. The examples we see here, these are both from travel in Italy a few years ago. One on the left is a basement window in a Palladian villa in the Veneto. The one on the right is a picture of two separate buildings and just how they happen to connect. But they each show different styles of windows and how they can reflect, or in this case the fenestration can affect the impression of what the rest of the structure would look like, whether from the inside on the left or on the outside on the right. One reason that I took the picture on the right, and what I'd like to go into it a bit, on the right you would have sort of what you see in Italy throughout, which is a series of protections the window affords from the environment. The window on the right has I guess on the top right, has a wood shutter, and behind that is two glazed casement windows. They both set within an opening, so that if this faced south, which I believe it did, you had a series of different ways that the window fenestration itself could have helped affect the environment, help control the light and heat that would be present in this climate. On the left, you have, in effect, what I assume to be a remodeled building at some point, only in that the glass that you see is fairly reflective. So you're looking in the top glazed unit that reflects the building across the street. And this is a consequence of what we have in glazing systems these days, and we'll be talking a lot, as Bill will later on, about different ways that windows become a part of the building envelope performance system. And in this case, I think you could make an assessment that not that the window on the left is worse or what, or the one on the right is older and better, but that it really conveys a different look. I mean, despite the exact detailing of the rather elegant stonework around the windows, they still have a nice wood window component. They, one has the iron bar grating in front of it. They look very old and authentic, but the glazing itself is new, and in fact, part of the energy conservation system of the building. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This sort of goes back to the notion of how we define ruin these days. This is an image of Thomas Jefferson's design for a mansion of sorts in north of Charlottesville, Virginia, in a place called Barboursville. It's designed for an important member of the Virginia Assembly named James Barbour. It was built before Jefferson's death, generally thought to be completed by 1822, and on Christmas Day in 1884, it burned, and it was never rebuilt. It didn't keep it from being placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1969. And I think that the header here probably says a broader concept of what we have from viewing structures, that windows, perhaps, depending on the type of building, of course, they're in effect the most fragile components that are subject to deterioration from the environment, or in this case, total loss. The structure itself is still present. We have some way of perceiving what Jefferson's design was and how Palladian it was in its siding and its orientation and its massing and volume that we can see in the image. Of course, we have no idea what the windows look like. And yet the building still obviously conveyed sufficient significance as well as association with Jefferson to be placed on the National Register. But it also lets you see what role windows do in fact play. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What we will see is a similar ruin, in effect. This also, much like Barboursville, was a structure built in 1883 in downtown Los Angeles. I was a historical architect on this project, and we did a rather complete rehabilitation and reconstruction of two adjacent buildings. The one you see on the left, and the before picture is the two-story Garnier block, and this was totally burned from the interior. The roof burned off when there was a fire that was set for warmth, and that's the condition the building had when we inherited it. Effectively, both that and the five-story building to the right were red tagged, and we were able to document through the on-site research and the documentation of the existing windows what could be repaired, what would need to be replaced. The image on the right, you see, of course, the glamorous after picture, which shows here's what we have from the effectively the windows that could be salvaged, which were minimal, but sufficient to give us information for profiles and for reconstruction. The skylight feature you see above was done in contemporary construction of aluminum framing, mostly because we only had some minor photographic evidence of what the skylight originally was, but enough to know that it was metal framed and to be able to judge what its appearance was. The very far right edge of that image shows a door with a transom light that you can pick out somewhat in the middle of the existing building. This was a doorway at the end of a hall, and what we assumed was a transom window. That design, of course, is lost, but we based that reconstruction on other transom windows over doors. So again, the idea of this is that when you do have a building that's generally been burned, and in this case, sort of a total loss, there's still enough fragments of evidence to be able to put back what is there. We'll also look at an image from this project later on in the presentation. Next, please. Part of what we interpret from the Secretary of Interior Standards and how we evaluate significance in both of the house itself, in this case, on the left, or the commercial structure on the right. The windows and, in fact, the fenestration and the detailing of the windows are part of the stylistic identity of the structure. On the left is Nevada City. This picture was taken at a CPF conference held there a few years ago, where it's clear that the style of the house, sort of the late Victorian era structure, doesn't necessarily mean that the windows are highly elaborate. In fact, these are about as simple 1/1 double-hung windows as you could find. And entertainingly enough, on the right, this is one of the Hayden Tract structures in Culver City, where it's a commercial building, but here's a double-hung window, but in a rather different stylistic vocabulary. In this case, a fairly simple building, but in effect, a very complex window design, if you perceive that to be kind of a bow window or a bay window. So the idea that there's a style that's conveyed by how the windows are constructed, not necessarily, but in terms of how they're placed and how they're celebrated or elaborated within the style of the structure itself. If we go to the next, please. again, we want to look at the stylistic identity of the structure and how you might perceive what the rest of the structure looks like. And in effect, the windows not only represent the style of the era, they reflect the style of the building. On the left is an image of the Veterans Chapel in the West Los Angeles Veterans Administration Chapel, also known as Wadsworth Chapel. I did a Section 106 report on this structure, and one of the issues, as you might imagine, was how do you repair and restore these windows? And what, in fact, is significant about them, of course, everything. The Gothic tracery in this particular window, but also the fact that in this chapel, it's a very unusual building, and that it was built as a dual chapel, the Protestants on the south side, the Catholics on the north side, and an acoustical wall that divided it. And the windows, in this case, this would be on the side of the on the south side of the building. So this is the Episcopalian side, if you will. This was all done in a Gothic style. On the north side, the Catholic side, was done in a Romanesque style. So in this case, the windows all had their individual identity, and actually very few of them were identical. There were many different types of windows. Part of the issue with this, of course, is, as you can see, some of the glazing was replaced without necessarily continuing to use the divided lights.
Taylor?
And besides the yes, ma'am.
Hey, Taylor,
yeah.
For some reason, no one can hear us. And Yvonne just slipped me a message here. So it says slides are moving, but no voice. Keep saying webinar will start shortly. Let me kind of regroup here. We got to pick up the pace a bit, so we're going to have to go back and start over, okay?
How do I know that I'm being heard?
Apparently I hit the start broadcast button. Let me. It's not doing it.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Cindy Heitzman with the California Preservation Foundation. I apologize for the technical difficulty here. We understand that you have not been able to hear the webinar. We are going to start it from the beginning and move quickly to the place where we left off. You were viewing the slides. Taylor Loudon was your speaker, and we're going to begin again from the beginning. Thank you so much for attending, and we apologize for this interruption. Do let us know through the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen, through the question and answer block, if you cannot hear us. Thank you. Taylor Loudon is our speaker.
Yes, hello. We're going to go through the first part of this fairly quickly now. The initial image you see sort of conveys how glamorous and artistic windows can be, and obviously that represents a rather significant contributor to the historical significance of this particular residence in Los Angeles. And what we're going to do is sort of scan through what we feel is a summary of how windows define the significance of the building and contribute to it, and we'll go through how compromises to windows can be averted or avoided, and how to make them continue to represent or contribute to the historic significance of the structure. Next, please. These are two images from structures in Italy, a Palladian villa on the left, an interior view of a basement window, and windows on the right from two adjacent buildings in Vicenza. And they show, in effect, how different responses are from windows to environmental conditions. The window on the upper right is one that's more typical of the previous technology of how windows are meant to keep out rain and sun and yet emit light. And the window on the top left would be what I assume is a replacement glazing in that it's highly reflective, reflecting the building across the street. Both of these windows, in effect, address energy conservation principles, one of the newer technology and one of an older. Next, please. The structure you see here is, in effect, a modern ruin, if you consider Jefferson's work modern, which I do. This was completed shortly before Jefferson's death by 1822. It was largely destroyed by a fire on Christmas Day in 1884, but that did not keep it from being placed on the National Register in 1969. And this certainly conveys the significance of the structure to see how much of the masonry elements were left in place and were not destroyed by the fire. Of course, as you can see, the house wasn't rebuilt, but neither were the windows replaced. But it certainly still conveys the sense of how the building did look originally, just absent all of the wood. It also shows, as the heading suggests, that windows are perhaps the most fragile parts of the building, subject to complete loss, if not just gradual deterioration, as most elements are. So the threats of age are especially difficult on doors and windows. Next, please. The image on the left is two Victorian buildings that were damaged by fire and deterioration in downtown Los Angeles near Olvera Street and the La Plaza Church. I was involved in this project, which involved using existing windows as design subjects to replicate in new construction. So on the right, you see what we were able to rebuild based on a complete survey of windows that were remaining. And in terms of the door and transom on the cutoff on the far right, what we were able to interpret from other doors and windows and transoms elsewhere in the building for a fairly accurate restoration of what had been lost. The skylight in this structure was documented in photographs as being a metal type of skylight. We did this as an aluminum frame system and replicating the original design and layout. And again, this is still somewhat of a contemporary ruin, but it shows what happens if you do build it back and how the processes might then work. We'll also see an example from this building later in the presentation. Next, please. In the concept that a window would convey not only the stylistic identity of the structure, but help place it within a time frame of when it was built, we have two rather different examples that show slightly different interpretations. In Nevada City at a CPF conference a few years ago, this is just one of the structures in downtown, and it shows that even though it's a high Victorian style building, the windows themselves are fairly simple, a 1/1 double-hung window with rather elaborate decoration, which helps set the window and its penetration within the stylistic identity of the house. On the right, in the Hayden track of Culver City, we have a slightly different view of how a double-hung style window can be interpreted in a more modern realm where it's a fairly complex window design and a fairly simple structure. Next, please. In an additional idea of how do you have a stylistic identity represented by a window, we have two examples of rather different aspects. One is, again, a National Register listed landmark building. The Veterans Administration Chapel in West Los Angeles is one of the many Gothic style in a half Gothic, half Romanesque style structure. And although it's fairly deteriorated for the paint and finish, The window itself is fairly intact. The idea of how the glazing has been replaced, not exactly in the style of the tracery, is not a good thing. But part of the issue of showing this is to describe how in the Section 106 application I produced for this project, the State Historic Preservation Office made the comment that they would not necessarily use a laminated glass material here, but would suggest instead storm windows as a way of energy conservation. On the right, these would represent the sort of standard jalousie window replacement windows. In this case, it might even have been the original window in this fairly modern structure. But it places the structure within the early post-wars and World War II era building, where there are a number of examples of replacement windows that were jalousies, mostly as the windows in the building boom of the 20s and 30s had deteriorated sufficiently by the time that modern replacement windows, in this case the jalousies, were a favorite to be used. Next, please. In this slide, we'd like to discuss briefly the importance of, in the lifespan of the material, for finishes and maintenance, and using a fairly modern example of a commercial building. Louis Kahn Salk Institute in La Jolla was built with the notion of using the most permanent materials that Kahn loved to use, namely concrete with wood material as a way of having a bit of warmth to an otherwise fairly cold system. And what we see here are the teak window frames and wood panels that show the effect of being out in the air for over 50 plus years now. Next, please. We see in the next slide how we have an example of two different types of teak and how they responded to exposure to the weather. It's important to consider how maintenance protocols should be followed, although Kahn's original specifications were that the teak should be allowed to weather to the silver gray that it will, which you certainly see more on the left than on the right. On the right, that almost looks like it's new material, and this might be indicative of the orientation, and maybe it's protected from the elements by being on an interior surface, or maybe the maintenance protocol associated with the material. Next, please. In this slide, the Roll Rogers Ranch House, we talk about an operational lifespan that in some of these windows, the two casement windows that you see on the left side of the house, these were original operating windows, and in our restoration of this house, we made the determination not to restore the original operating conditions to the windows, but to allow those that had become fixed to remain so. For the windows that did operate, we thought it was important that they still continue to operate despite the mechanical engineer's desire to have a closed, humidity-controlled system. And as a way of improving the energy performance, we used applied and reversible vinyl weather stripping systems to achieve a greater sense of energy, of efficiency, and conservation. We also, due to the interior furnishings, we're somewhat obligated to use a high UV value glazing to replace on the south and west facing windows. Next, please. Going into more of the modern era again, and to introduce the notion of code, we have sort of a confluence of Title 24, the State Historical Building Code, and the new Green Code ordinances, which unfortunately are often used as justifications for removing the original windows in a structure. In this case, this is somewhat famous in Los Angeles in that it's the Century Plaza Hotel. It had been on the National Trust 11 Most Endangered lists a few years ago, and it was proposed for complete demolition because this was a very energy inefficient structure. And it was stated that it would be a far more sustainable green approach if, in fact, the structure was demolished, because mostly of the aluminum and glass windows. This was averted and conservation approach made to how do you maintain the existing aluminum storefront system and the glazing. Next, please. Continuing with the notion of codes and regulations, just listing briefly 4 of the Secretary of the Interior standards as applying specifically to windows and how deterioration should be repaired rather than replaced, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure everybody's familiar with these by now. The next slide would show that, of course, in terms of interpreting what are considered very general standards, the National Park Service has preservation briefs, and just again quoting briefly, number 9 discusses repair of historic and wooden windows, and brief 17 is a more general one, but it talks about how the visual aspects of the historic buildings are, and how this is a way of preserving their character in terms of, in particular in our instance, how windows help define that character. Next, please. The next item has the, again, it's another part of what the National Park Service does that's extraordinarily helpful. On the left is one of their technical preservation services briefs, and this one happens to be number 56, alterations without historical basis, and it talks, in the case shown, it's about how a commercial building was revised to create a false sense of historical development. On the right, I show again, this happens to be the other side of the Garnier block that we discussed earlier. Again, remembering that this had been generally destroyed by fire, and of course the cornice that you see in the upper right photo from 1920 era, we had the lower left condition. The cornice had already been removed in the 60s and 70s by the county, and we relied on historical photographs and analytical surveys to recreate the cornice and entablature that you see, as well as the windows, which of course did not look like this when we started. Next, please. There are so many ways that you can show examples of bad, so I try to convey it all in a few short images, but I think everybody has an understanding of what the problems are of replacement windows. And you can still see in many cases, as in the lower right, the original form of the house and how it had been effectively anesthetized by application probably of stucco over what probably was wood siding originally, and of course the ubiquitous sliding aluminum or viable windows. Upper right, an Egyptian court-style residential structure with windows that are, again, the aluminum sliders, presumably not in the Egyptian style. The center, again, we have seen often replacement windows that don't quite add, even if it's in terms of the color of the muntins, that they don't quite fit within the character of the structure that's there. And below them, you don't often see the side-by-side, the original casements on the left, and then the center on the right, the sliders. So in all of the structures here, in the ones on the left, you see some of them that have the original windows, and on the other half of the building or the building next door, they do not. These all happen to be the Westlake Park area of Los Angeles, where there's a huge variety of structures, as you can see. And unfortunately, of course, you can also see how quickly things can go awry. Next, please. Again, this goes back to how things can go wrong. And on the right, of course, when openings are made smaller, in some cases, it's actually as awful as this might look. And we'll see in the next example we use here, you can still appreciate the original opening here. It wasn't tried to be made to reflect the new window size. So as unorthodox as it might seem, that actually is replicating the original condition more effectively than what you would have, where it may be that some of the windows were obliterated in the resurfacing of a residence. Next, please. So here we arrive at the Miracle Mile North Historic Preservation Overlay Zone, where I happen to be the board architect. This might look like a horrible example of a window replacement, but in effect this is, as a non-contributing structure, allowable to replace, in this case, these had been jalousie windows, and they were being replaced with sliders. I use it as an example to introduce briefly the notion of flashing. And this is the black material surrounding the very white window frame. And you can see what looks like an overcut of the plaster. That's basically to be able to install the flashing to the way the manufacturer standards would say was necessary through window warranty. Next, please. In this example, it's the same house on the left as you saw before. In this case, it's a, of course, smaller window and what was originally a wider opening. And again, it's very hard to replace plaster material and not have it show through. So in the example on the right, you can almost see telegraphed what the original size of the window was. It probably had a head that matched the head of the little window on the right. And of course, you see by that little window to the right what the original character of the window that's now gone probably was: a projected windowsill, a radius plaster jam return at the jams in the head. So often you don't appreciate the image that you have to plaster surfaces as a result of window replacements, but perhaps now you see that. Next, please. The final example in the contemporary construction, again, this is how windows are flashed, and you are now familiar with the black flashing that surrounds these new windows. If you have a brand new facade, you don't have a start and stop of plaster finish. So this new mansion in Beverly Hills will, in fact, look fairly consistent with its neighbors. One way of understanding flashing in the example on the right is from a 1932 graphic standards book. It shows that flashing is actually fairly noticeable. So if it's not underneath the surface material, that's what you will end up seeing, especially these days if it's done not as copper, but as a stainless steel or aluminum. It's a fairly bright and different product. Next, please. The next slide, what we'll be looking at is, straying afar from the wood windows, and then we'll hear from Bill. But what we see here is possibly one of the great examples of modern architecture of all time. If you follow the work of SOM, you know that's the Lever House in New York. There's a lot of anecdotal stories about this, including how difficult it was to match the original spandrel glass color. What happened here is that this was a building where curtain wall effectively was invented or was created for this building in New York by SOM. And by the year 2000, some almost 20 years after it had been designated a landmark, it was totally rebuilt from the building skin point of view. So you have the idea where the effective windows on a structure are not necessarily that it's now a new facade on a landmark building, but maybe it's more original than the original building was. Also introducing the notion of modern architecture and the commercial style, how modern as landmark is an issue. When this was designated around 1982, the notion that there would be modern landmark structures was still fairly new in New York, and it was fairly controversial at the time. Next, please. In the next image, we have an ongoing project. This picture was taken several years ago at the part of the New York Convention Center, which is a vast building built about 1982, time that the Lever House was being designated as a landmark, no one would confuse this necessarily with a landmark now, but on the other hand, it's being proposed to be demolished. In the meantime, they're replacing every unit of glass because, in effect, the technology at the time wasn't sufficient to actually make it be a fairly energy efficient and useful building. So the current technologies are being applied in this case to how this structure could at least serve still as an interim structure. And the next slide, please. And my final slide before Bill picks up, the notion also to look to the future. This is Frank Gehry's IAC headquarters building, again in Manhattan. And the notion with this is that, you know, Gehry's signature style in this case, his first building that was done totally in curtain wall, is an example of, well, you know, how would this be replaceable or replicatable in the future should it become a landmark? And keeping in mind that as window technology advances, which Bill will, I'm sure, address in his next bit, this is an example of how the window technology certainly reflects the era. If you think of the replacement windows of the jalousies in the post-war era, they were all the rage at that time, as wood windows were looked at as being old technology and old school. And now what we appreciate is, in fact, those are as significant. The wood windows were significant not only in detail and the character they would define with a house in this case, but they would also be perceived as being a fairly, for the era, advanced in terms of how water is conveyed from the outside of the building without getting in terms of metal flashing and interlocking jambs and that sort of thing. So to move to Bill, that's it for the architectural implications.
Thanks, Taylor. As we're changing panelists here, Cindy, go ahead and swap that over. That was wonderful. I see where I've got to be looking ahead to as we launch into this 20th century. It's amazing stuff. I'm going to start out my part of the program here just with a little bit of a review about historic wood windows. It's always good to start out with some basics, parts and pieces of the windows. Go ahead, Cindy, to the next slide. And after which point I'll talk a little about some of the review and survey that we go through to give you a little feel for that, and then cover some of the most common issues that we incur in window restoration, and then finally wrap up with a little round of myth busting. It's always good to have the myth busters on track here. So starting out with a wood double hung window, you see in the slide here all the various parts and pieces. When we meet with folks, my staff and myself, it's always a matter of getting some of the vernacular down, and as I continue in this talk, it's helpful to understand the difference between a sill and a stool. On the outside, if you look in the bottom right, you'll see the sill horn, which is really what we call the sill. As difference from the inside, we're looking at the inside here, the stool is that inside shelf. A couple other words, I won't go through all of these, but you've got the little sticking between the glass, the little fine lines of wood. We refer to those as muntins, often mistakenly called mullions. They can be used somewhat interchangeably, but we usually refer to them, in this case, when they're finer and smaller, as muntins, obviously the glass. And then finally, you've got the sash, are the parts that move up and down, and the top rail is the top piece of each sash, and the bottom rail is the bottom of each sash, and the stiles are the sides. If you look over here, people are often interested, how do these things go up and down? Actually, they're counterbalanced with weights, often made out of pig iron or lead. And you can even see up here on the outside of the jamb the sash pulleys that we still use today when we're doing actual replication. Okay, often we use these parts and pieces. If we go to the next slide, just an example of where we will start out a project is typically looking at a photo. Someone's going to send us a photo to get us engaged, as many of you are, This is a picture of Hoover Pavilion on the Stanford campus. It's was a hospital and is being restored right now. We're just wrapping up a project here in our shop, which included the restoration of some 450 sash. And then in addition to that, it ended up we had to replicate a number of sash that were just too far gone. And then we actually, as Taylor was talking about, sometimes have to refill or infill some complete window units in the building to look identical, or what we call perfect to match on that building. So we'll take it from here and often drill down into a survey or maybe some close-up shots. Our next shot is of a similar but different project. This one is out in Fresno. We fondly refer to it as HOAB, the Historical Old Administration Building. Funny how they make these sorts of names up for catchy phrases. It's on the Fresno City College. And you can see as you get a little closer to the building here, the condition of the wood windows. And I'll just point out some of the things that caught my eye initially on the survey. And sometimes we'll do a survey 2, 3, in this case 5 years prior to the work actually being completed. Glass is falling out. You've got some probably some muntins that are coming off. The bottom rail, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, is actually missing entirely. Presumably the functionality of these windows is somewhat compromised, and there very well may be even some dry rot in some of these joints. So those are just visually what impact me, but the first step is often to provide a collated list of all these sorts of items and many others, and we often will get involved in that along with the customer or independently. And you may see this as well. This is a very small shot. I apologize for the small scale, but if you'd like a copy of this file, I'm more than happy to send this on to you, and Cindy can share us with you later how to get hold of the presenters as well as the recording of this program. But just in a basic framework, it's got the name of the building. In this case, this particular draft was designed specifically for double-hung windows, and all of the problems that it's talking about, if you look carefully, it actually refers to the parts and pieces, the bottom rail, the top rail, the left jamb, interior, exterior, any notes that we may have. And in this upper section, we may do it on an iPad, or I think when I did this earlier, I did it on some kind of a tablet PC, because I might have been going through 50 or 75 windows, and we'd make little sketches and as well as shooting pictures about the windows. So this will get transferred from this point of a survey into a master spreadsheet or a window schedule that might spell out all the different issues for all the different windows in the building or part of the building that we're evaluating. And it'll call out some of the most common sorts of issues that we come across, whether it's the muntins, we talked about glass, rot, paint, operation, weather stripping, broken glass, things of that sort. If we go to the next slide, this is oops, go back one here. Got my little 3-second delay here. Try that again. I'm going to back up to there. Okay, so what this slide is showing here on the left, just to point out a couple of tools of the trade, dealing with wood windows, one of the most common elements that we have to deal with is glass. As glaziers, we're dealing with broken glass or glass that's not sealing correctly. And the craftsman here is using what's called a hack-out knife. You can see the knife is being hit on the back edge of it, almost like a bread knife, but it's got a leather handle on it to give you a little absorbing there. And he'll go wrap in order to chop off or remove the cracked or the broken putty. And that's the process, often with some scraping as well, resealing and or repriming those areas. And then in the lower right, you can see the application of the putty, and in this case they're using a bent putty knife. That's my preference. And it's applying the product. In this case we're using DAP 33 In the video to follow, we're going to show just a 1-minute clip here on the next page showing the application, which really is a bit of an art to apply putty, and many people look at that. I don't know if we're going to have sound here. I think we will. Let's see if this rolls here. We'll give this video technology a. Here we go. If the audio doesn't work, I'll give you a kind of an update as we go. This is an old window. That's a ball of putty. If anybody wants to shoot back a message here, if you can hear sound, let me know, or if you can't, that'd be good to know. But what he's doing is kneading the putty. In this case, he's wearing his gloves and softening up the putty to get it to a point where he can work it. And it's much the substance of Play-Doh or almost like bread dough. But you want to get it warm and supple. That's the very first and very important thing to do. As I mentioned earlier, we use DAP 33, which is a soy-based product. And then it's a matter of applying it carefully onto the prepared window. And it's much the same as putting peanut butter onto a hamburger bun. First, you got to get it on there, and then you smooth it out. And then if there's excess, you'll take it off. Got a little, I don't know about your connection. Mine's a little jittery, but you get the idea here in the process. This is where he's actually smoothing it out and removing the excess, leaving a nice straight line of putty. And this is something that takes weeks, if not months, to do this. If you want to watch this, there's the key there, and there's actually a follow-up on YouTube of this presentation, how to do the glass, how to do the putty. Let me go on to the next slide. And this is a little diversion. It looks like we're talking about putty here, but this slide is actually, I'm going to take a diversion here away from putty and explain to you the 2-quarter test. This is developed here at Wooden Window. It sounds kind of funny, but it's actually become a bit of a standard around here for us to explain how bad is bad enough, or how good is good enough. In this case, we've got an old window with muntins that have certain damage, and the issue is how much historic element do you want to leave? How much of that character is okay? And one way to measure that is by the depth of 2 quarters and or the width of a quarter. And in this case, the architects involved and the property owners were okay with if it wasn't any bigger than 2 quarters thick, then it was okay. If it was deeper than 2 quarters thick, then we had to replace that part. And we're going to see in just a minute what's involved in fixing a muntin. This is a brief video showing the repair of a wood window muntin on a old historic window. And what they're actually doing in this video is not replacing the entire muntin, but doing a Dutchman repair on the glazing bar itself, or what I call a muntin. If you look carefully, you can see how the bottom part of it, it's actually, or the upper part of your screen, is chipped away. So the intent here is to make it nice and flat in an area where a new piece can be applied. So he's going to take off a little bit of that historic fabric, and then after that's removed, doing it so he doesn't cut himself, he'll go ahead and replace that. He's using a utility knife, very common tool, to get a relatively flat area. See, it just comes off. I think he snaps it off like a twig in a minute here. And He's using a typical wood chisel to get that nice and flat, after which point you'll see what he does to make that good again. This level of detail often we don't see in today's work. People just want to put in that brand new window. But this is very doable, and it's not very complicated. You can see it has a level of danger factor, but with the necessary care, you can repair a wood window very easily. So in this case, he's taking glue to fasten it in there, and then he'll take a clamp to put it in. Well, I'm going to move ahead to my next slide here. And this is talking really about dry rot, which is something that we encounter all the time, and when we're brought onto projects, it's the most common effect. If it's not glass or broken muntin, it's about dealing with dry rot, which occurs to windows when they're exposed, particularly if the paint isn't well kept. Water will get into any seam or any joint, and if the water doesn't evaporate and dry out quickly enough, you get the beginning of the formation of a fungus, or what we call dry rot. And it's pretty ugly stuff, as you can see here. The bottom corner of the window there's not much left of it. And you can notice that the joint is gone. Dry rot is really like a fungus, and it can grow if it's left untreated. It can grow very rapidly, and a lot of it has to do with the temperature or the humidity in the air, or certainly how much water we're having. Years where there's not a lot of rain, the advance of fungus is slow. Years that we're having more rain, you can get more fungus. And the windows that are on the north side or the east side, where they're not getting as much sun, they can actually have a significant amount of rot because they're not getting dried off by the warmth of the sun. Having said that, windows on the south and west sides of a building often get the most weather, and the paint is most destroyed. So in actuality, that's where we will find the most problems with windows, are on the south or the west sides. So I'm going to advance, and we're going to see a little bit here. I won't spend too much time on it, but it's one of the ways to deal with dry rot specifically on a wood window. There are a number of companies out there that manufacture different magic solutions. All of them are some level of epoxy. Let's see if we can get this. Trying to advance my slide. There we go. And this is my last little video snip showing the process of doing a dry rot repair using an epoxy consolidant. The first job really is to prepare the substrate, just like you are if you're going to paint. But it's most critical when working with epoxies to have a nice clean surface, and that usually involves some level of stripping or scraping or wire brushing the wood to get it to a place where you can do that. And this team here from this painting company shows a nice example of the process. What we're looking at is the bottom corner of a windowsill where it meets the stucco mold or the brick mold. So once again, what he's doing here is cleaning off the putty, exposing the wood. And at that point, he starts doing cleaning it off. You can see the wood is left nice and clean. You can start to see some of the areas where there's problems on this window by painting on this two-part epoxy, what we call the part 1. Or sometimes refer to it as the olive oil consistency, peanut oil. You mix 2 parts together in that little paper cup and apply it. It helps firm up the wood's fibers. And over on the left-hand side, you can see where there was a void. After that part 1 is dry, they come back and put the part 2. Once again, it's 2 parts that you mix together, apply it into the void, and it bonds very nicely to the part 1. And then it's furthermore sanded and smoothed off, and then finally painted. These guys being paint contractors, that's part of their service. Something we do here in our shop quite a bit of is using epoxy too. Go on to the next slide. Something else that we get involved in that people are often curious about, as well as doing the survey and analysis, and we talked about the kind of 3 basic areas: the glass, the wood, the muntin repair. This has to do with testing or window testing, and that's usually wrapped around either air infiltration or water. This gentleman here is from ATI, Architectural Testing, and he's doing a on-site kind of demo of his system here, doing an air test. On the right side behind Leighton is a machine that measures the air velocity in and the air velocity out. As you can see, there's a hose going over to the window with a manifold in order to section off the window to see what the airflow is like on this particular sample window. This was just dragged out from our showroom. This is not a particularly great airtight window, but it's really wonderful to see the test and be able to show this. This was actually at a CPF event a couple years ago where people came out and got to see, touch, feel this experience of air testing, which we always read about in reports. But the idea is, with an old window, is what can you do to make it as good as a new window? A lot of people, as we get into the myth busting, say that's just impossible. But through this process, you can set up a baseline and make that happen. I'm seeing a note here. Stand by. Okay.
Bill, this is Cindy. That was just a question I wanted to give our attendees a
Okay.
reminder that
Very good.
if you have any questions, please feel free to send in a question through the Q&A box, and our speakers will answer them after the presentation.
And we're just almost to our myth-busting section here, but I did want to chat a bit very much related to the air testing and water testing is what sort of weather stripping. This is one way to, and the most viable way to deal with those intrusions that we don't want, the air or water. And this sketch here is showing us some of the critical areas where the 2 windows come together. Here on this middle sketch B, you can see the meeting rails of a double hung window, where the top rail of a bottom sash is meeting the bottom rail of a top sash, and that's an evident place where air will typically be very drafty. Oftentimes when you latch it, it'll help reduce that air, but if there's a way to get a gasket in there, you're all the better off reducing that air infiltration and getting a better rated window, and obviously more comfortable. Other places where that becomes important is at the top, where the head of the window, or the top rail of the top sash meets the head jamb. And then lastly, well, 2 more places. The bottom, where the bottom rail meets the sill, and then on the sides of the window, and we are showing a lot of double hungs today, the most common window out here, where the window slides up and down. And we'll often use a brush seal there, a silicone bulb on the tops and the bottoms, and then also a flap or a silicone bulb in the middle of the window. And optimizing these different types of weather stripping based on the application and whether it's being compressed or whether it's sliding is the best way to optimize their performance and therefore the performance of the window. storm windows come up. Out here on the West Coast, we don't see very many storm windows, but from where I hearken from, New York State, storm windows were quite prevalent. And even though we don't see them here, they're a very usable tool, particularly around preservation. And my sense is we're going to see more and more use of wood storm windows or other materials of storm windows used on preservation windows, because you can actually leave a window that might be in good shape, and by implementing the use of a storm window, optimize its energy efficiency. And you can further optimize it by using high-performance glass if you choose to. Instead of just regular anneal glass, you could use a low-E glass on a storm window and use that along with a window, keeping the old window and just applying this outside storm window. And if you look carefully, this is one drawing. I've got another shot coming up that shows you in an application where it's been installed in a building. But I wanted to show this to you so you can really visualize, for those of you that haven't really seen storm windows, how it attaches, usually from some hooks at the top of a window, and often fitting right into the rabbet where the original wood screen might have fit, or it could be adapted to other types of wood windows. Of course, storm windows don't work so well on outswinging casement windows, which is the second most common window that we have here in California. This next shot here that I'm going to bring up shows the original windows without a storm window, and these are traditional single light double hung windows with nice wavy old glass. You can see a little reflection off of there, which adds a lot of character. And then with the addition of the storm window, this manufacturer included a faux check rail, if you look here in the middle, to still emulate the look of a double hung window. You may not have quite the visual depth, Taylor will probably comment on that you do with a double hung window, but it really does emulate it. And these are removable, by the way. A lot of times people will put them up in the winter on the East Coast and take them off during the summer, store them in their garage or in their basement. Another real good application for storm windows briefly is around sound. Having 3 inches between the two windows, between the inside glass, or maybe it's 1.5 inches, that really does a fabulous job of giving sound insulation. Sometimes we've done storm windows with laminated glass, which really makes quite a superior sound insulator. Okay, that's what I've got in regards to storm windows, and now I just wanted to, I'm going to probably cut these a little short. I've got a number of myths, but let's just hit the first 3 or 4 of them, Cindy, and then allow time for Q&A. Does that make sense? The first myth that we often hear about is in regards to energy. So more energy is lost through old windows than through uninsulated walls. I think we can bust that. In other words, really the windows of a house attribute to only about 10% of the heat loss in an older house. So the trick there then is really, yes, you can address the windows, but you're better off spending your dollars on insulating your walls and your ceiling and or roof than worrying about replacing your windows. That should always be the first approach when trying to make your space more comfortable. Myth 2, replacement windows are a more permanent architectural solution for window problems. Well, my comment there would be manufacturers often offer lifetime warranties for their windows, the typical modern replacement windows. What they don't make clear is that 30% of the time, a replacement window will be replaced within 10 years. So I kind of make fun of that in-house. So that's not the case with all manufacturers, but quite a few of them. You just can't find the parts and pieces of a replacement window 10 years later, not to mention the company might not be around. But with an old wood window, as we saw earlier on the presentation, those parts and pieces can be replicated with basic, very simple tools that have been around for a long, long time. Replacement windows are, oops, let me move to the next slide. Replacement windows are as environmentally friendly as restored windows. Ooh, boo-hoo. Well, I think we all know that replacement windows, the majority of them are made out of vinyl in today's age, aluminum before. Both of them are highly energy intensive. The vinyl windows obviously contain vinyl or PVC. They're toxic to produce, and they create toxic byproducts. So installing those sorts of windows is really not a green approach at all. And I think I'll wrap up with this last one. New windows will last longer than restored ones. Well, I think we've got to break that myth too. If your wood windows are 60 years or older, the chances are that the wood they're made of is old growth. It's really dense, it's durable wood that's somewhat scarce now, but we still have access to really fine woods that will last a long time as well. But in even high-quality new wood windows, except for mahogany, won't last as long as an historic wood window, I guess is the comment here. The historic windows have the old growth, really tight growth rings, long-lasting wood. So if there's any way you can save that, it will outlast any replacement window. And I'm going to hand it back over to Cindy for Q&A, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Bill. Bill, you had a few more myth busters on here. Did you want to take them on?
Well, time permitting, we can do that. Do I have time?
You do have time. We don't have any questions coming through, so just a reminder to everyone who's listening that if you have any questions, be sure to send them in while we have our panelists online. They can answer them for you. So keep rolling, Bill.
Okay. Well, myth 5. New replacement windows are more energy efficient than historic windows. Well, it so happens that studies have demonstrated that a historic wood window, properly maintained, weather stripped with a storm window, which we talked about, can be just as efficient as a new window. Surprise, surprise. Myth 6. The energy saved by installing new replacement windows will pay for the cost of purchase and installation. I like this one. You'll find all kinds of numbers on this, but the biggest numbers I've seen is, according to studies, it can take 240 years to recoup enough money in energy savings to pay back the cost of installing replacement windows. Even if you have that, 120 years, or even more, a quarter of that, it's really hard to get a payback on your energy savings in dollars. Myth 7. Replacing historical windows with new ones has no negative environmental impact. I think many of us know this already, but each year America will demolish 200,000 buildings. That's about 125 million tons of debris, or enough waste to construct a wall 30 feet high and 30 feet thick around the entire U.S. coastline. Every window that goes into the dump is adding to this problem. Myth 8. Restoring and repairing old windows is difficult and expensive. Well, with a little bit of practice, as you saw in some of these videos, and the help of YouTube, it can be easy, it can be inexpensive to repair and maintain your old windows. And, if you're not the do-it-yourselfer type, restoring and maintaining windows maybe doesn't make sense for me. Well, there are people near you that can do it for you. Hiring a skilled tradesperson to repair your windows fuels the local economy and helps provide jobs. And CPF can help you there as well. And then the last myth, number 10, it's the overall architecture of the building that is important, not the windows. That's thought-provoking. Maybe Taylor wants to weigh in on that, but historic wood windows are an important part of what gives your older building its character. Thank you.
Okay. Well,
and I think I have one closing shot here, just to circle back, see if it shows up on some of the earlier photos back at HOAV. After the windows have been restored, you can't help but notice just the wonderful glisten off the beautiful glass, the condition of the wood, and in this case, it's a city college, and it's being used for education, just like this program is, to share some of the ideas and thoughts between people Nothing like being in a space like this from the interior shot with the restored ley lights above and the restored windows on the side there. Makes me want to go back to school too. So thank you for coming to our school today. We've got some resources on the next page, which will be available to you as well, which many of these facts have been brought from.
I'd like to thank our panelists today, G. Taylor Loudon with Loudon Historical Architecture and Bill Essert, President of Wooden Windows. We thank them. They have donated their time today in putting these programs together for your use. We will be sending you copies of the presentation, so you'll have them for your reference. And again, thank you for bearing through our technical problems at the beginning of the program. Please feel free to send us any comments or questions. We will forward them to our speakers so they can answer them for you directly. And we thank you again for attending today. We thank you for supporting CPF. And lastly, we'd like to remind you that the California Preservation Conference will be held May 3rd through the 6th at the Oakland Marriott City Center, and we hope to see you there. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Cindy.
Hey, Taylor, great job.